Welcome to another wonderful Annie Clayton audiobook. We are excited to have you with us. Before we begin the story, please like and subscribe to our channel and share it with friends. This allows us to continue adding free clean Western romance audiobooks for you to enjoy. The following title is copyrighted by Tika House Publishing. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and enjoy the story. The Proper Wife. Chapter 1: The Advertisement. The harsh spring rain pelted against the narrow window of Alice Foster's boarding house room, creating rivulets that distorted her view of Boston's cobblestone streets below. Her fingers, pricked and calloused from years of seamstress work, traced the edge of the newspaper spread before her on the scratched wooden desk. The evening edition of the Boston Daily had arrived damp, its pages wrinkled from the precipitation, but the matrimonial advertisements remained legible enough. One particular notice caught her eye, standing out among the dozens of others that crowded the page's bottom corner. Unlike the brief, utilitarian posts seeking hardy women of good Christian character, this one bore a certain eloquence. Seeking a bride of refinement and determination for prosperous Texas cattle ranch. Lady must possess practical skills, appreciation for hard work, and desire for a true partnership in building a future. Age 20 to 25 preferred. Ranch house newly constructed, town with modern amenities within reasonable distance. Will provide for travel expenses. Correspond with Mr. Walter Holmes, Cedar Creek, Texas. Alice's throat tightened as she read the words again. At 22, she fell squarely within the requested age range, and none could deny her practical skills. She'd been supporting herself with needle and thread since her mother's passing 3 years prior. The word refinement gave her pause, but she straightened her spine, remembering the education her mother had insisted upon before consumption had claimed her life. A gust of wind rattled the windowpane, and Alice pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders. The coal in her small stove had burned low, and Mrs. Brunswick, her landlady, was notoriously stingy with fuel rations, even in early spring when Boston's chill refused to release its grip. The promise of Texas warmth suddenly held additional appeal. She reached for her mother's writing desk, a portable wooden lap desk that was one of the few fine possessions she'd kept after selling most of their belongings to pay for the funeral. The brass hinges creaked as she opened it, revealing her dwindling supply of good paper and her favorite pen. The ivory handle had a crack, but the nib was still sharp and true. "Dear Mr. Holmes," she began, then immediately crossed it out. Too familiar. "Mr. Walter Holmes," she wrote instead, her normally steady hand betraying a slight tremor. "I write in response to your advertisement seeking a bride." Alice paused, dabbing her pen in the inkwell as she considered her next words. The scratch of pen on paper mingled with the drumming of rain, creating a rhythm that steadied her nerves. She had written hundreds of letters in her life, to clients, to suppliers, to her mother's family who had long since stopped responding, but none had held the weight of this one. "I am a woman of 22 years, currently residing in Boston, where I have established myself as a seamstress of some reputation. My clients include several of the city's most respected families, and I am well versed in both practical sewing and ornamental needlework. While I take pride in my profession, I find myself longing for a fuller life than my current circumstances allow." She stopped again, considering whether to mention her family situation. Would her lack of living relations be seen as a benefit or a deficit to a potential husband? After a moment's contemplation, she decided on honesty. "I am an only child, and with both my parents now deceased, I am free to relocate without family obligations. My mother ensured I received a proper education, including household management, basic accounting, and the social graces expected of a lady. I am in excellent health, accustomed to long hours of detailed work, and eager to contribute to building a successful life in Texas." A floorboard creaked in the hallway, and Alice hastily covered her letter with a piece of scrap fabric as Mrs. Brunswick shuffled past her door. The landlady had strong opinions about marriage advertisements, never failing to mention her own daughter who had gotten ideas below her station and moved out west, only to stop writing after 6 months. When the footsteps faded, Alice retrieved her daguerreotype from its hiding place beneath her mattress. She had spent nearly a week's earnings on it last year, justifying the expenses necessary for business cards to attract wealthy clients. In the image, she wore her best dress, navy silk with modest lace at the collar, and her dark hair was arranged in the latest fashion. The photographer had positioned her to minimize the slight lopsidedness of her features, though nothing could be done about the stubborn set of her jaw, which her mother had always said betrayed her determination. She studied the image critically. Would Mr. Holmes find her attractive enough? The advertisement hadn't mentioned beauty as a requirement, but she wasn't naive enough to think it wouldn't matter. Perhaps more importantly, would he see the intelligence in her eyes, the capability in her straight-backed pose? A door slammed somewhere in the boarding house, and voices rose in argument about the shared bathroom at the end of the hall. Alice glanced around her small room, at the narrow bed with its thin mattress, the battered sewing machine that had been her mother's pride, the single hook on the wall that served as her wardrobe. Was she truly prepared to leave all that was familiar for an unknown future in Texas? Her gaze fell again on the newspaper advertisement, and she found herself thinking of the word partnership. Not service, not mere marriage, but partnership. She resumed her work on the letter, her resolve strengthening with each carefully chosen word. The oil lamp flickered as Alice completed her letter, carefully blotting each page to prevent smudging. She had rewritten it twice, each version more refined than the last, until she was satisfied that it struck the right balance between honesty and propriety. The final paragraph had given her trouble, but she was pleased with its current form. I understand that building a life in Texas requires fortitude and courage. While I have never lived outside of Boston, I am no stranger to hard work and challenging circumstances. I believe that my skills, determination, and sincere desire to build a meaningful partnership would make me a suitable match for your requirements. I have enclosed my daguerreotype and would welcome further correspondence to discuss your expectations and our potential future. She signed her name with her best penmanship, adding her boarding house address below. The sharp rap at her door nearly caused her to upset the inkwell. Miss Foster? Mrs. Brunswick's voice carried through the thin wood. I smell your lamp burning awful late. You'll not be getting extra oil this month, mind you. I'm just finishing some urgent work, Mrs. Brunswick, Alice called back, hastily beginning to gather her writing materials. I'll extinguish it shortly. See that you do. And there's a matter of your rent to discuss tomorrow. Prices are going up all over the city, and I can't be expected to operate at a loss. Alice's heart sank as she heard the landlady's heavy tread descend the stairs. Another rent increase would make it nearly impossible to maintain her small room and continue eating regularly. Her fingers brushed against the newspaper advertisement, and her resolve strengthened. She couldn't allow fear of the unknown to trap her in a life of ever-diminishing possibilities. She carefully folded her letter and the daguerreotype together, then reached beneath her bed for the small box where she kept her savings. The coins inside rattled quietly as she counted out enough for proper postage. She would need to mail it first thing in the morning, before she lost her nerve. Sleep proved elusive that night. Alice lay in her narrow bed, listening to the gradual quieting of the boarding house and the persistent patter of rain. Her mind wandered to Texas, trying to picture the ranch mentioned in the advertisement. Would there be Indians? Bandits? Her only knowledge of the territory came from sensational newspaper stories and the occasional dime novel she glimpsed in shop windows. She had no illusions about the difficulties she might face, but surely they couldn't be worse than watching herself slide slowly into poverty here in Boston. Dawn arrived with weak sunshine and the usual morning clamor of the boarding house. Alice dressed quickly in her second-best dress, the blue wool that showed few signs of mending, and pinned her hair in a style that was neat but not too fashionable. She had 3 clients scheduled for fittings today, and she needed to project capability without appearing expensive enough to drive them to cheaper seamstresses. But first, the letter. The post office opened at 8 o'clock, and Alice intended to be there when it did. She tucked the precious envelope into her reticule and made her way down the narrow stairs, hoping to avoid Miss Foster. A moment of your time. Mrs. Brunswick stood in the doorway of her private parlor, her gray hair already perfectly arranged beneath her cap despite the early hour. Alice's heart thundered as she noticed the torn envelope in the landlady's hand. I've had a letter from my Margaret, Mrs. Brunswick said, her voice rough with emotion. Posted 3 months ago from Kansas Territory. She's gone and married a farmer who advertised for a wife. She thrust the letter toward Alice with trembling fingers. Read it yourself. Living in a sod house. My daughter, who learned piano and French, cooking on a fire pit and wearing calico. Alice took the letter automatically, her own carefully crafted missive burning a hole in her reticule. The handwriting was elegant but hurried, the paper of poor quality. Dearest Mama, she read aloud, I know you warned me against answering the advert, but I have never been happier. John is a good man, and though our home is humble, it is ours. The work is hard but satisfying, and I am expecting our first child in the summer. Expecting! Mrs. Brunswick snatched the letter back. My grandchild will be born in a house made of dirt. And now she writes that they're planning to move even further west, to Oregon Territory. I'll never see them again. She dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. I tell you this as a warning, Miss Foster. I've seen you with that newspaper, studying those adverts. Don't think I haven't noticed. Alice straightened her spine, summoning every ounce of dignity her mother had instilled in her. Your Margaret sounds very happy, Mrs. Brunswick. Perhaps she's found exactly the life she was meant to live. The landlady's eyes narrowed. You have one of those letters in your bag right now, don't you? Ready to throw your life away on some stranger's promises? My life is my own to direct, Alice said quietly, but with steel in her voice. As is Margaret's. Good day, Mrs. Brunswick. I'll have my rent ready on the 1st, as always. She managed to maintain her composure until she reached the street, where she finally allowed her hands to shake. Margaret's letter had affected her more deeply than she cared to admit, not with fear, but with a strange sort of envy. Despite the hardships, the other woman had seized her chance at a new life and had found happiness in the unexpected. The post office was just opening its doors when Alice arrived. She approached the counter with steady steps, withdrew her letter from her reticule, and handed it over with exact postage. As she watched it disappear into the sorting basket, she felt an odd mixture of terror and exhilaration. God help me, she whispered to herself as she stepped back into the spring morning. I've actually done it. The bells of Park Street Church began to toll 8 o'clock, reminding her of her waiting clients. Alice squared her shoulders and turned toward her work. She had set her course, but there was still a living to be made until she received a reply, if she received one at all. She refused to consider that last possibility. Something in her heart told her that Mr. Walter Holmes of Cedar Creek, Texas would indeed write back, and that her life would never be the same. Chapter 2, The Journey Begins. 3 weeks had passed since Alice had mailed her letter, and Mr. Holmes's response had changed everything. The heavy cream envelope, bearing a Texas postmark and surprisingly elegant handwriting, had arrived just yesterday. Now she stood in her small room, surrounded by the remnants of her life, deciding what to keep and what to sell. Her mother's sewing machine, the Winchester new improved family model that had faithfully served them for over a decade, sat draped in a cloth on her desk. Mr. Peterson from the dry goods store had offered her a fair price for it, enough to sustain her if something went wrong. The thought of parting with it made her throat tight, but Mr. Holmes had been clear in his letter. The ranch already possessed a newer Singer machine, and space on the wagon from town would be limited. A practical decision, Alice murmured to herself, running her hand along the machine's smooth surface one last time. Her mother would have understood. Sarah Foster had always said that sentimentality was a luxury poor women couldn't afford. The spring sunshine streamed through her window as Alice methodically sorted through her possessions. The trunk she'd purchased, secondhand but sturdy, gaped open on her bed, already half-filled with carefully rolled clothing. She'd sold most of her fashion magazines to a younger seamstress, keeping only the most recent issues that detailed practical adaptations for country living. A soft knock at her door interrupted her packing. "Come in," she called, expecting Mrs. Brunswick with another dire warning about life out west. Instead, Mrs. Chen, the Chinese laundress from the first floor, stepped into the room. Her dark eyes took in the scene of organized chaos with understanding. "So, you go soon, Miss Foster?" "The day after tomorrow." Alice smiled at the tiny woman who had been quietly kind to her since her mother's death. "The train leaves at 8 in the morning." Mrs. Chen nodded, then reached into her wide sleeve and withdrew a small package wrapped in red paper. For your journey. Tea from my homeland. Very good for settling stomach on long trip. Alice accepted the package with both hands, recognizing the formality of the gesture from her years of watching Mrs. Chen interact with her customers. Thank you. I don't know what to say. Say nothing. Just remember, new place, new life, same you inside. Mrs. Chen's English might have been imperfect, but her wisdom needed no translation. Many say America land of opportunity. But opportunity not just in big city. Sometimes hiding in big sky instead. The unexpected gift brought tears to Alice's eyes. She carefully placed the tea in her trunk, wrapping it inside one of her chemises for protection. When she turned back, Mrs. Chen had already slipped away as quietly as she'd come. Wiping her eyes, Alice returned to her task. The afternoon light was fading, and she still had much to do. Mr. Holmes's letter lay on her desk, and she found herself reading it again, though she'd memorized every word. Dear Miss Foster. Your letter speaks to both your character and skills. I am impressed by your candor regarding your circumstances and your evident willingness to face the challenges of ranch life. The enclosed bank draft will cover your travel expenses, with enough remaining for any necessary purchases before your departure. I suggest you book passage on the Texas and Pacific Railway to Dallas, where my brother Jacob will meet you with a wagon for the final journey to Cedar Creek. The bank draft had indeed been generous, far more than she'd expected. After purchasing her ticket and trunk, she'd had enough left to buy 2 new dresses suitable for ranch life, a sturdy pair of boots, and still set some aside with her small personal funds. The magnitude of his trust humbled her. Or perhaps, she thought practically, it was simply a demonstration of his financial stability. Alice moved to her wardrobe, removing the dresses she'd decided to sell. Her best silk would fetch a good price from Miss Hampton down the street, who catered to ladies wanting last season's fashions at a discount. The blue wool she would keep. Texas might be warm, but Mr. Holmes had mentioned that spring evenings could be cool. At the back of the wardrobe, her fingers brushed against soft leather. Her mother's journal. Alice drew it out slowly, running her fingers over the worn cover. The last entry was dated just 3 days before the consumption had finally claimed her. My dearest Alice has such strength in her, though she knows it not. I pray she will one day find a life worthy of that strength, even if the path to it leads her far from all she knows. Alice closed the journal firmly and placed it in her trunk. This, she would keep. Not out of sentimentality, she told herself, but because her mother had somehow known, had understood that her daughter's future might require a journey into the unknown. The last morning in her boarding house room dawned gray and cool. Alice had barely slept, her mind racing with last-minute concerns about everything from the safety of her funds, sewn into a hidden pocket in her petticoat, to the wisdom of her entire decision. But as she donned her traveling dress, a practical brown wool that wouldn't show the dirt of travel, she felt her determination return. Mrs. Brunswick was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, her face set in grim lines. I've made you a package of bread and cheese, she said, thrusting a brown paper parcel toward Alice. Train food is highway robbery, and that's assuming they stop long enough for you to buy any. Thank you, Alice said, surprised by the kindness. I appreciate. Don't appreciate anything, the landlady cut her off. Just right when you arrive. Unlike some ungrateful daughters who forget their mothers exist. But her eyes were suspiciously bright as she helped Alice maneuver her trunk out the front door. The hired cart driver was prompt, at least. Alice watched as her trunk was secured, then took one last look at the boarding house. 3 years of her life were contained in those walls. 3 years of grief and struggle and survival. She lifted her chin and climbed onto the cart's wooden seat. South Station was already bustling when they arrived, filled with a mix of well-dressed businessmen, laborers, and families. Alice paid the cart driver and then faced her first challenge, finding a porter who wouldn't take advantage of a woman traveling alone. She was studying the crowd when she noticed a well-dressed older woman struggling with her reticule. A young man in shabby gentility was approaching from behind, his hand reaching slowly toward the lady's pocket. Without thinking, Alice called out sharply, "Madam, you've dropped your handkerchief." The woman turned, disrupting the pickpocket's approach. A nearby policeman noticed the scene, and the would-be thief quickly disappeared into the crowd. The woman, retrieving a handkerchief from her pocket that she hadn't actually dropped, smiled at Alice. "Quick thinking, my dear. I am Mrs. Augusta Blackwood, and I believe I owe you my thanks." Alice introduced herself, and within minutes found herself sharing a porter with Mrs. Blackwood, who was traveling to St. Louis to visit her son. Better still, they would share a car for the first leg of the journey. "I simply cannot abide traveling alone," Mrs. Blackwood declared as they settled into their seats. "So dreary, and one never knows what sort of person might sit nearby." "You must tell me all about your journey. Visiting family in Texas, perhaps?" Alice hesitated, but something in the older woman's kind eyes encouraged honesty. "I'm traveling to meet my future husband." "Ah." Mrs. Blackwood's expression showed understanding rather than judgment. "A marriage arrangement?" Through an advert, Alice admitted, then found herself sharing the whole story as the train pulled out of the station. "Brave girl," Mrs. Blackwood said when she'd finished. "My own daughter took a similar path last year, went to California to marry a merchant she'd corresponded with. They're quite happy now, though I miss her terribly." She patted Alice's hand. "Let me share some advice about traveling alone." The next hours passed pleasantly as Mrs. Blackwood proved to be both an experienced traveler and an engaging companion. She taught Alice the subtle signals that would ensure dining car staff treated her with respect, and which conductors could be trusted to keep an eye on a lady's belongings during necessary stops. Around mid-afternoon, another woman joined their conversation during a meal stop. Sarah Jenkins was perhaps 30, with a pleasant face and quick laugh, traveling to meet her own advertisement match in Arizona territory. "My second marriage," she confided over cups of mediocre dining car coffee. "My first husband died of cholera in '72. I never thought to marry again, but being a widow in Philadelphia." She shrugged. "A woman needs protection in this world, and I'd rather choose it for myself than have my brothers choose for me." But as Sarah shared more details about her intended, a mining camp supervisor who'd sent for her with glowing promises, Alice felt a growing unease. The arrangement seemed hasty, the man's letters filled with elaborate promises rather than practical details. When Sarah dozed off, Mrs. Blackwood leaned close to Alice. "Trust your instincts about people out here," she whispered. "The West attracts dreamers and schemers alike. Your Mr. Holmes sounds like a solid sort, sending specific travel instructions, arranging proper transport. This mining fellow." She shook her head slightly. Alice thought of her own carefully planned journey, the practical arrangements, and felt a surge of gratitude toward Walter Holmes. Whatever else awaited her in Texas, at least she was traveling toward a man who appeared to value order and forethought. As sunset painted the unfamiliar landscape in shades of gold and purple, Alice opened her mother's journal again. A pressed flower fell from between its pages, a forget-me-not from the small garden they'd once tended behind their old house. She tucked it carefully back, remembering her mother's words about strength. The rhythm of the train's wheels seemed to echo with possibility. Each mile carried her further from everything familiar, but also closer to everything she might become. She touched the hidden pocket containing her funds and Mr. Holmes's letters, then turned her face toward the darkening window, watching as the known world fell away behind her. Chapter 3: Arrival in Cedar Creek. The Dallas station was a far cry from Boston's South Station. Wooden planks creaked beneath Alice's feet as she descended from the train, gripping her reticule close. The platform teemed with a motley assortment of cowboys, merchants, and families, their voices carrying traces of drawls she'd only read about in novels. The April sun beat down with unexpected intensity, making her wish she'd packed her parasol more accessibly. She'd bid farewell to Mrs. Blackwood the previous day in St. Louis, and the absence of her traveling companion left her feeling oddly vulnerable. Sarah Jenkins had continued on toward Arizona, brushing off Alice's carefully worded concerns about her intended with a laugh and a wave. "Mr. Walter Holmes's party?" a porter called out, consulting a piece of paper. "Got a lady coming in from Boston?" Alice stepped forward, her heart hammering. I'm Miss Foster. The porter nodded, already reaching for her trunk. Got word to watch for you, miss. The Holmes wagons run in late on account of the spring mud, but you're to wait in the station master's office. Much more suitable than the general waiting room for a lady. The station master's office was small but clean, with a window overlooking the bustling street outside. Alice sank gratefully into the offered chair, smoothing her travel-wrinkled skirts. Her reflection in the window showed a face flushed with heat and anxiety, her normally neat hair coming loose from its pins. 1 hour passed, then 2. Alice occupied herself by watching the street traffic, cowboys leading horses, women in calico dresses that would have drawn criticism from Boston society, children darting between wagons with reckless abandon. Everything seemed larger here, more vivid, less constrained by propriety. Miss Foster? She turned to find a young man standing in the doorway, his hat in his hands. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of a summer sky. His clothes, though dusty from travel, were of good quality. I'm Jacob Holmes, he said, offering a slight bow. Walter's brother. I apologize for the delay. The creeks run in high from the spring rains, and we had to find a safer crossing. Alice's carefully prepared greeting caught in her throat. This was not what she'd expected. His brother before her couldn't be more than 25. For some reason, she'd expected him to be much older. You're very kind to come, she managed, finally, rising from her chair. I hope it wasn't too much trouble. A smile flickered across his face. No trouble at all, miss. Though I should warn you, the ride to Cedar Creek won't be easy. The rains have turned every road to mud, and we've got a good 3 hours ahead of us. The porter appeared with her trunk, and Jacob handled it easily, lifting it into the wagon's bed as if it weighed nothing. He offered his hand to help her up onto the wagon seat, then wrapped a clean blanket around her skirts. To protect against the mud, he explained, climbing up beside her. Walter would have my hide if I delivered his bride-to-be in a soiled dress. He laughed heartily. The wagon lurched forward, and Alice grabbed the seat's edge. She'd never ridden in an open wagon before, and the motion was entirely different from a proper carriage. Jacob handled the horses with obvious skill, navigating the crowded streets until they reached the outskirts of town. May I ask? Alice began, then hesitated, unsure of proper etiquette in this situation. The photograph your brother sent. Ah. Jacob's expression tightened slightly. You expected me to be older, is that it? Well, here I am, just a kid. He chuckled. The photo he sent was taken some years ago, before his first wife passed. He doesn't like having his picture made these days. First wife. The words fell like stones in Alice's stomach. Walter's letters hadn't mentioned a previous marriage, though she supposed she shouldn't be surprised. Many men out west had lost wives to the hardships of frontier life. They passed the last buildings of Dallas, the road deteriorating into little more than a muddy track. The wagon wheel sank alarmingly in places, and Jacob had to concentrate fully on managing the team. Alice found herself studying his profile when he wasn't looking, the straight nose, the firm jaw, the way his hair curled slightly at his collar. Look out! Jacob called suddenly, but too late. The wagon wheel hit a deep rut, throwing Alice against him. His arm shot out to steady her, strong and sure, then withdrew quickly. I'm so sorry, she stammered, straightening herself. No harm done, he said, his voice carefully neutral. Though you might want to hold on to the seat rail. The road only gets worse from here. As if to prove his point, the sky darkened with approaching rain clouds. Alice felt the first drops hit her face as Jacob reached behind the seat, producing a proper oilskin coat. Put this on, he insisted. Walter was specific about keeping you dry. The coat was warm from the sun and smelled of leather and something distinctly masculine. As Alice drew it around her shoulders, she couldn't help but wonder if it belonged to Jacob or his brother. She wasn't sure which possibility unsettled her more. The rain intensified, drumming against the oilskin coat and turning the already treacherous road into a river of mud. Jacob handled the team with silent concentration, his shoulders tense as he guided them through the worst spots. Twice they had to stop so he could clear debris from the wheels. "Perhaps we should seek shelter," Alice suggested after a particularly loud crack of thunder made the horses sidestep nervously. Jacob shook his head. "No proper shelter between here and the ranch. Besides, Walter is expecting us." Something in his tone when he mentioned his brother made Alice glance at him sharply, but his expression revealed nothing. The rain eventually slackened to a drizzle, allowing Alice to observe the changing landscape. The trees were different from those in Massachusetts, shorter, more twisted, with smaller leaves. Occasionally they passed small homesteads, their gardens showing the first green shoots of spring planting. "Tell me about the ranch," she said, breaking the long silence. "Your brother's letters mentioned it was prosperous, but provided few details." "Double H Ranch," Jacob replied, his voice warming with evident pride. 600 acres, good water rights, decent grazing land. We run about 800 head of cattle, more in good years." He paused, then added, "Though it's Walter's ranch now, not mine. I just help manage it." "Now?" "It was our father's. When he died 5 years ago, Walter inherited as the eldest. Traditional, you might say." Another pause. "Your letters to Walter, they showed a good understanding of business matters." He mentioned that specifically. Alice shifted uncomfortably. "My mother insisted I learn bookkeeping along with my other studies. She said a woman should always understand her own finances." "A wise woman, your mother." Jacob guided the wagon around a fallen branch. "Though I should warn you, Walter has his own ways of doing things. He's not always open to new ideas." Before Alice could pursue that concerning statement, the wagon crested a small rise. Below them, stretching across a valley painted green with spring grass, lay what could only be Double H Ranch. The house was larger than she'd expected, a 2-story structure with a wide porch and what appeared to be a new addition on one side. Several outbuildings clustered nearby, and in the distance, she could make out the shapes of cattle grazing. "It's beautiful," she breathed. "It can be," Jacob agreed softly. "In the right light." They descended the slope carefully, the wagon wheels leaving deep tracks in the mud. As they drew closer, Alice could see more details: the weathered wood of the barn, the vegetable gardens struggling to survive against the spring rains, the empty clothesline strung between posts. A dog began barking, and several ranch hands emerged from the barn. But there was no sign of anyone who looked like the photograph Walter had sent. "He's probably in town," Jacob said, answering her unspoken question. "There was a Cattlemen's Association meeting today. He'll be back by supper." He brought the wagon to a stop near the house. "Let me show you to your room. You'll want to freshen up after the journey." Alice allowed him to help her down from the wagon, trying to ignore the way his hands lingered for just a moment at her waist. Her boots sank into the mud, and she nearly lost her balance. Jacob steadied her again, this time with a hand under her elbow. "Careful," he murmured. "The ground's treacherous after rain." The front door opened, and an older woman appeared, wiping her hands on her apron. "Lance sake, Jacob, you're both soaked through. Bring Miss Foster inside before she catches her death." "Mrs. Hattie Sullivan," Jacob introduced her. "Our housekeeper since, well, for quite some time." Mrs. Sullivan clucked her tongue as she ushered Alice inside. "And a good thing too, or this house would fall to ruin with just men running it. Come along, dear. Your room's ready, though I told Mr. Walter that the addition needed more work before being proper for a lady." Alice followed her through the house, noting the solid furniture and clean but sparse decorations. The addition Mrs. Sullivan mentioned turned out to be a bedroom on the ground floor, its walls showing fresh saw marks and its window lacking proper curtains. "It's not finished," Mrs. Sullivan said apologetically. "Mr. Walter insisted you'd want your own space, but the weather's delayed the work. There's gaps in the walls where the wind comes through something fierce." Alice set her reticule on the rough-hewn dresser, her heart sinking. The room was barely habitable, nothing like the newly constructed chambers Walter had described in his letters. "I'll fetch fresh water fair washing," Mrs. Sullivan offered. "And perhaps Mr. Jacob could bring your trunk." But when they returned to the front of the house, Jacob was gone. Through the window, Alice could see him riding toward the cattle pens, his figure gradually disappearing into the misty distance. Left alone, Alice sank onto the room's single chair. The wind whistled through the wall gaps, carrying with it the sound of approaching hoofbeats. She straightened her spine and began repinning her hair. Walter Holmes was coming home, and their first meeting would set the tone for everything to follow. She only wished she could silence the small voice in her head that kept comparing the brothers and finding Walter wanting before she'd even met him. Chapter 4: Harsh Realities. Walter Holmes was nothing like his photograph. The man who strode into the house as dusk was falling carried himself with the rigid posture of someone who expected and demanded respect. His hair had indeed gone gray at the temples, but his face was harder than the daguerreotype had suggested, weathered by sun and time into deep lines around his mouth and eyes. He was tall, taller than Jacob, but without his younger brother's easy grace. "Miss Foster." His voice matched his letters, precise, controlled, brooking no argument. "I trust your journey was satisfactory?" Alice rose from her chair in the parlor, where Mrs. Sullivan had insisted she wait in relative comfort. "Yes, Mr. Holmes. Your brother was most attentive to my safety during the drive from Dallas." Something flickered across Walter's face at the mention of Jacob, but it disappeared so quickly Alice wasn't sure she'd seen it at all. He crossed the room in 3 long strides and took her hand, his grip firm but not gentle. "You'll find things are different here than in Boston," he said, releasing her hand. "Mrs. Sullivan will explain your duties for tomorrow. I expect breakfast at 6 sharp, the men start early, and a ranch wife must adapt to ranch schedules." Before Alice could respond, he turned to Mrs. Sullivan, who hovered anxiously in the doorway. "The Cattle Association meeting went well. Prices are up in Kansas City. We'll need to push the men harder to get the herd ready for the drive. Make sure it's ready 8 for breakfast tomorrow, not 6. Davidson and Miller are staying over." With that, he strode out, his boots echoing on the wooden floors. Alice remained standing, her hands still tingling from his grip, her mind struggling to reconcile this brusque man with the measured, almost poetic letters she'd received. Mrs. Sullivan touched her arm gently. "Come along, dear. Let's see about getting you settled. Have you eaten?" The kitchen was warm and surprisingly well equipped, though Alice noted that many of the pots showed signs of harsh handling and poor care. Mrs. Sullivan set about making tea and cutting thick slices of bread while explaining the morning routine. "Breakfast for 8 ranch hands, plus Mr. Walter and Mr. Jacob," she said, her capable hands moving swiftly. "They'll expect biscuits, eggs, bacon, and potatoes at minimum. Coffee must be strong. Mr. Walter is that particular about his coffee. You'll want to start the stove by 5 at the latest." Alice's stomach tightened. I'm afraid I've never cooked for so many people. In Boston, I was a seamstress." Mrs. Sullivan paused in her work. "A seamstress?" But surely Mr. Walter knew. She pressed her lips together. "Well, we'll manage. I can help you tomorrow morning, show you how it's done." Though Mr. Walter prefers his wife to handle the cooking herself. His wife? The words sent a chill through Alice despite the kitchen's warmth. She was not yet his wife, would not be for several weeks according to his letters. Yet already he was dictating her duties, assuming her compliance. "Tell me about his first wife," she said quietly, watching Mrs. Sullivan's face. The housekeeper turned away, busying herself with the teapot. Miss Catherine was a local girl. Very pretty, very young. Mrs. Sullivan hesitated. "The fever took her 2 years ago. Her grave's just beyond the kitchen garden. Mr. Walter had it placed where he could see it from his study window. Said it would remind him to be more careful in his choices." Alice's tea grew cold as Mrs. Sullivan continued explaining the household routines, when the men ate, how much food to prepare, which ranch hands were trustworthy and who needed watching. Through the kitchen window, she could see a small white marker in the growing darkness, its pale stone a stark reminder of what waited for those who failed to meet Walter Holmes's expectations. A floorboard creaked behind them, and Alice turned to find Jacob in the doorway, his clothes and hair still damp from the rain. "Thought you might want these," he said, holding out a package wrapped in oilcloth. "Noticed your room's a bit drafty." "Extra blankets from the bunkhouse, clean ones," he added quickly. "And some rags to stuff in the worst gaps until the walls are properly finished." "Mr. Jacob," Mrs. Sullivan scolded, "it ain't proper for you to be concerning yourself with Miss Foster's sleeping arrangements." "Better than her freezing to death before the wedding," he replied, but his eyes never left Alice's face. "Besides, Walter is too busy with the cattle drive preparations to worry about finishing her room. Someone has to look out for his bride's comfort." The way he said his bride made Alice's cheeks warm. She accepted the package, careful not to let their fingers touch. "Thank you. You're very kind." "Not kind," Jacob said softly. "Just decent." He nodded to Mrs. Sullivan and disappeared again, leaving behind the faint scent of rain and leather. Alice clutched the blankets to her chest, suddenly overwhelmed by the contrast between the brothers, one so concerned with appearances and proper behavior, the other with genuine comfort and need. She had agreed to marry Walter Holmes based on his letters, his supposed stability and refinement. But now, standing in his kitchen with his first wife's grave visible through the window, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. That night, Alice barely slept. The wind found every gap in the unfinished walls, creating an eerie whistling that reminded her of Boston's winter storms. She had stuffed the rags Jacob provided into the worst cracks, but still the April air crept in, carrying with it the unfamiliar sounds of Texas nights, coyotes in the distance, the lowing of cattle, the creak of the windmill outside her window. She rose well before 5, putting on her sturdiest dress and pinning her hair severely back. The kitchen was dark and cold when she entered, but she found the tinderbox where Mrs. Sullivan had shown her and managed to light the stove on her third try. Her hands shook as she measured coffee into the large pot, 2 generous scoops per man, Mrs. Sullivan had instructed, and an extra for the pot. Dawn was just breaking when Mrs. Sullivan arrived, taking in the scene with experienced eyes. "The biscuits should already be in the oven," she said, quickly tying on her apron. "Here, I'll show you the recipe Mr. Walter prefers. His mother's method, though between us, I've adjusted it some over the years." Alice threw herself into learning, trying to focus on each task rather than her growing anxiety. The biscuits were in the oven and the coffee was perking when heavy boots sounded on the porch. Walter entered first, followed by 2 men she didn't recognize, Davidson and Miller, she presumed. "Coffee's weak," Walter announced after 1 sip. "You'll need to do better tomorrow, Miss Foster." He turned to the ranch hands. "Eat up. We need to move those cattle to the north pasture before the rain starts again." Alice felt her face burn as she added more coffee to the pot. Behind her, she heard one of the men mutter something that made the other laugh, not unkindly, but with the weary knowledge of men who had seen other women try and fail to meet Walter Holmes's standards. Jacob arrived last, nodding to Alice as he took his coffee. "Smells good in here," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Those biscuits remind me of Mother's." The compliment, though kind, only served to highlight the awkward silence that followed. Alice served plate after plate, trying not to let her hands tremble as she managed the heavy platters. When she finally sat down with her own breakfast, she found she couldn't eat. "The garden needs attention," Walter said as he finished his meal. "The last girl we hired to tend it let the weeds take over. I expect you'll want to make it your first priority after the breakfast dishes are done." Alice looked out the window at the neglected plot, its rows barely visible under the spring growth. "Of course. Though I should mention, I've never tended a garden before. In Boston, we. Then it's time you learned." Walter stood, his chair scraping against the floor. "A ranch wife must be able to provide fresh vegetables for her table. We can't be running to town for supplies every time we need onions or potatoes." After the men left, Mrs. Sullivan helped Alice clear the dishes. "Don't take it too hard, dear," she said as they worked. "Mr. Walter, he's been different since Miss Catherine passed. The garden was her pride and joy. He couldn't bear to see anyone else touching it for the longest time. What happened to the girl he hired? Mrs. Sullivan's hands stilled in the washbasin. Clara? She left after a month. Said she couldn't bear the way he watched her from his study window, finding fault with everything she did. She glanced nervously at the door. Though you didn't hear that from me. Alice walked to the window, studying the small white marker that served as Catherine's grave. The morning sun cast long shadows across it, reaching like fingers toward the tangled garden beyond. Something caught her eye, a flash of color among the weeds. Moving closer, she realized there were flowers blooming despite the neglect. Spring bluebonnets pushed up through the chaos, their delicate petals a stark contrast to the harsh reality of her surroundings. As she stood there, she heard the study door open behind her. Walter's reflection appeared in the window glass, watching her as she watched the garden. The weight of his gaze felt heavy, expectant. She straightened her spine, remembering her mother's words about strength. I'll need proper tools, she said without turning around. And seeds, if you expect me to plant for summer vegetables. Everything you need is in the garden shed, Walter replied. Catherine's tools are still there. They should suit you well enough. His boots clicked across the floor as he left, but Alice could still feel his presence, as if his shadow lingered in the doorway. She pressed her hand against the cool window glass, creating a barrier between herself and Catherine's grave. The bluebonnets swayed in the morning breeze, survivors in this harsh land. Like them, she would have to find a way to take root and flourish, or risk being torn out like the weeds Walter so despised. Behind her, almost too quiet to hear, Jacob whispered, "Don't let him break you, too." Then he was gone, leaving Alice alone with the ghost of Catherine's garden and the growing certainty that she had stepped into something far more complicated than a simple marriage of convenience. Chapter 5: Finding Her Place. Alice's fingers flew across the rough fabric, her needle flashing in the afternoon light. Around her, scattered on the porch's wooden planks, lay piles of ranch hands' clothing in various states of disrepair. Torn shirts, split seams, and worn patches, each telling its own story of hard work and harder falls. "Ma'am, you don't have to do this," Pete Davidson said, watching in amazement as she transformed his favorite work shirt from a tattered rag into something wearable again. "We're used to makin' do." "Nonsense," Alice replied, tying off a neat row of stitches. "I may not be much use in the kitchen yet, but this is something I can do well." She didn't add that she desperately needed to feel competent at something after 3 days of burned biscuits and bitter coffee. The arrangement had started that morning when she'd noticed young Billy, one of the newer hands, trying to mend his own shirt with clumsy stitches that would never hold. Before she knew it, word had spread through the bunkhouse that the boss's intended knew her way around a needle. "Could you maybe look at my coat too?" Billy asked shyly, holding out a worn leather jacket with a torn lining. "Winter's gone, but nights are still mighty cold." Alice examined the tear. "Bring me your mending in the afternoons, after the lunch dishes are done," she said. "I'll see to it all, but in exchange, I need something from each of you." The men gathered closer, curious. Even Walter, passing by on his way to check the cattle, paused to listen. "Teach me," Alice continued. "Each of you knows something about running this ranch that I need to learn. Pete, you managed the kitchen garden last season after Clara left. I need to know which vegetables do well in this soil. Billy, I've seen how you handle the cook stove in the bunkhouse. Show me your technique for keeping the temperature even." She looked up to find Walter watching her, his expression unreadable. For a moment, she feared he would forbid the arrangement, but he merely nodded once and continued on his way. "Well, I'll be," Pete said, grinning. "That's fair trading, ma'am. Though I ought to warn you, my gardening knowledge mostly comes from watching Miss Catherine and trying not to kill what she'd planted." Alice's needle paused for just a moment at the mention of Catherine's name, then resumed its steady rhythm. "Tell me about her garden. What grew well? What failed?" As she worked, Pete described Catherine's careful plotting of the garden rows, her experiments with different plants, her success with tomatoes and beans. Alice listened intently, mentally cataloging each detail while her hands stayed busy with repairs. By late afternoon, she had a pile of mended clothing and a head full of practical knowledge about Texas gardening. More importantly, she had begun to establish herself as something more than just Walter's intended or Catherine's replacement. "Miss Foster?" Jacob's voice startled her from her work. She looked up to find him holding the reins of 2 saddled horses. "If you've finished with your mending, there's something you should see." Alice glanced at the remaining pile of clothes. "I should really finish." "The light's perfect right now," he insisted. "And this concerns the ranch's future." "Your future." Something in his tone made her set aside her needle. Walter was in town for the afternoon, meeting with the bank about cattle drive financing. Surely a short ride would be acceptable, for ranch business, of course. Jacob helped her mount with careful hands, then swung easily into his own saddle. "Pete showed you about the garden?" he asked as they rode away from the house. "Yes. He was very helpful." Alice adjusted her skirts, grateful she had changed into her sturdy riding habit. "Though I gather most of his knowledge came from watching Catherine." "Pete was sweet on her," Jacob said quietly. "Half the men were." She had a way about her, always smiling, always gentle. Until near the end. Alice's horse stumbled slightly, and Jacob reached out to steady her reins. "The end?" she prompted. "The fever, officially." His jaw tightened. Though she'd stopped smiling long before that. Stopped tending her garden too, which wasn't like her at all. They rode in silence for a while, climbing a gentle slope that offered a view of the entire ranch. The spring sunshine painted everything in shades of gold and green, from the new grass in the pastures to the fresh leaves on the scattered trees. "Look there," Jacob said, pointing to where a creek wound through the property. "That's what I wanted to show you." "The water rights Walter mentioned in his letters?" "They only cover the south branch. But that north fork, the one that runs through Marshall's property, that's deeper, more reliable in drought. Marshall's getting old, looking to sell." Alice studied the landscape, understanding dawning. The ranch could expand. Double in size, with the right management. Jacob turned in his saddle to face her. The right partnerships. The way he said partnerships made her heart beat faster, though she kept her expression neutral. "Does Walter know about Marshall's plans to sell?" "Walter sees what Walter wants to see," Jacob replied after a long moment. "He's focused on the cattle drive, on doing things the way they've always been done. But this ranch could be more. With the right vision, the right." He trailed off as thunder rumbled in the distance. Alice followed his gaze to the gathering clouds on the horizon. A spring storm had approached silently while they talked, its dark mass threatening. Jacob immediately turned both horses toward home. "We'll have to ride hard," he said. "That's a bad one coming." They had covered perhaps half the distance back to the ranch when the storm hit. The rain came suddenly, sheets of water that soaked through Alice's riding habit in seconds. Lightning cracked overhead, causing the horses to shine nervously. "The line shack." Jacob shouted over the wind, pointing to a small structure Alice hadn't noticed before. "It's closer than the house." They raced for the shelter, rain stinging their faces. Jacob dismounted first, quickly helping Alice down before leading both horses under the shack's small overhang. Alice's hands shook as she wrung water from her skirts. "Here." Jacob shrugged out of his coat and draped it over her shoulders. The small cabin smelled of leather and wood smoke, with a narrow cot in one corner and a pot-bellied stove along the wall. "I'll get a fire started." "You're shivering." "What is this place?" Alice asked, watching as he efficiently laid kindling in the stove. "Line riders use it during winter months, when we need to check the far pastures." The kindling caught, and Jacob added larger pieces of wood. "We keep all the line shacks stocked with basic supplies. Just in case." Just in case of what, Alice wondered, but the warmth from the stove was making her more comfortable and even a bit drowsy. Her clothes steamed slightly as they dried, and she found herself studying Jacob as he moved around the small space, his wet shirt clinging to his shoulders. "We shouldn't stay long," she said. though the storm showed no signs of lessening. It wouldn't be proper. Jacob's laugh held little humor. Proper. You're right, Walter is very concerned with what's proper. He turned to face her, his expression intense. Did you know he wrote those letters to you weeks before Catherine was even buried? Had them all drafted and ready? Alice felt her breath catch. What? He likes to plan ahead, my brother. Everything arranged, everything controlled. Jacob took a step closer, then seemed to catch himself. I should check on the horses. He disappeared into the rain, leaving Alice alone with this new and disturbing information. She moved to the shack's single window, watching as Jacob adjusted the horses' lead ropes. His shirt was now completely soaked, and she could see the play of muscles beneath the wet fabric as he worked. The storm's intensity increased, thunder booming directly overhead. One of the horses reared in fright, breaking its lead rope. Jacob lunged for it, but his boots slipped in the mud. Alice rushed outside without thinking, grabbing the trailing rope as the horse dashed past. Pull hard! Jacob shouted, scrambling to his feet. And brace yourself. Alice dug her heels into the mud, throwing her weight back as Jacob taught her during their riding lessons earlier that week. The horse, surprised by the resistance, slowed enough for Jacob to catch up and calm it with practiced hands. They stood in the rain, both breathing hard from the excitement. Water trickled down Alice's face, and she was suddenly aware of how close Jacob stood, his hand still covering hers on the lead rope. You're good in a crisis, he said softly. That's worth more out here than bein' proper. A particularly bright flash of lightning illuminated his face, and Alice saw something there that made her heart race faster than any spooked horse could manage. She stepped back quickly, nearly slipping herself. We should go back inside, she said. Until the storm passes. The line shack seemed smaller when they returned to it, the air heavy with more than just storm pressure. Alice removed Jacob's coat from her shoulders, handing it back despite his protests. Tell me more about Catherine, she said, needing to break the tension. About the letters Walter wrote. Jacob stoked the fire, his back to her. I found them in his study after she died. All arranged in order. Ready to be sent to whatever bride he chose next. He straightened, still not looking at her. That's when I knew he'd never really loved her. She was just filling a role. Like you're meant to do now. Why didn't you tell me this before? When I first arrived? Would you have believed me? Now he did turn, his eyes meeting hers with uncomfortable intensity. Or would you have thought I was just a jealous younger brother, trying to cause trouble? Before Alice could respond, they heard hoofbeats approaching. The door burst open, revealing Walter, his face dark with anger. So this is where you've been, he said, his voice dangerously quiet. Taking shelter from the storm, I suppose? Walter, Jacob started, but his brother cut him off. Get back to the house, Alice. Mrs. Sullivan will help you change into something more appropriate. His eyes never left Jacob. I need to discuss something with my brother. Alice hesitated at the door, looking back at Jacob. His face had gone carefully blank, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. As she mounted the spare horse Walter had brought, she heard their voices rise in argument. The rain had softened to a drizzle by the time she reached the ranch house, but Alice felt chilled to her bone. Whether from the wet clothes or from the realization that she was just another piece in Walter Holmes's carefully arranged life, she couldn't say. Chapter 6: Growing Tensions. The morning after the storm, Jacob didn't come to breakfast. Alice's hands shook slightly as she poured coffee for the ranch hands, her eyes constantly darting to his empty chair. Walter sat at the head of the table, calmly buttering his biscuit as if nothing was amiss, but the tension in the room was palpable. Pass the jam, Miss Foster? Pete asked, his voice deliberately casual. A dark bruise marked his cheekbone, earned, he'd claimed, from a run-in with a gate during the storm. But Alice thought she had seen similar marks on Jacob's knuckles the few times she'd glimpsed him from her window since yesterday's confrontation. However, he'd been too far away to be sure. Found 2 calves drowned in the south pasture, Walter announced, folding his newspaper. If someone had been watching the herd instead of taking social rides, we might have saved them. Alice's cheeks burned, but she kept her voice steady. I'll mend the clothes from the rescue efforts. The men must have torn things pulling the other cattle to higher ground. See that you do. Walter stood, straightening his vest. And Alice? I'll be giving you your first riding lesson this afternoon. No sense troubling my brother with such tasks now that I'm free to handle them myself. The ranch hands suddenly became very interested in their breakfast, avoiding her eyes. Only Pete gave her a sympathetic glance as she gathered empty plates with trembling fingers. Later, as Alice sorted through the pile of mud-stained, torn clothing in the kitchen, Mrs. Sullivan appeared with a cup of fresh coffee and a concerned expression. Drink this, child. You look pale. The housekeeper glanced over her shoulder before continuing in a low voice. Mr. Jacob is in the north pasture, checking fences. He's had worse from his brother before. Alice's hands stilled on a torn shirt. Worse? How long has this been going on? Mrs. Sullivan sighed, settling into a chair. Since they were boys, really. Mr. Walter was always the responsible one, doing exactly what their father expected. Mr. Jacob was wilder, more like their mother, God rest her soul. She died when they were young, but I remember how she used to laugh, how she'd dance in the kitchen when she thought no one was watching. And their father? A hard man. Believed discipline was the only way to raise sons strong enough for ranch life. Mrs. Sullivan's weathered hands worried at her apron. He'd have approved of how Mr. Walter turned out. The younger one, though, there was always trouble when Mr. Jacob showed too much of his mother's spirit. Alice picked up her needle, using the familiar motion of mending to steady herself. Walter mentioned giving me writing lessons today. Yes, well. Mrs. Sullivan's mouth tightened. Miss Catherine took her lessons from him too, after they married. She'd been such a fine rider before, used to love galloping across the property. But after, she stopped riding altogether eventually. Said she'd lost the joy in it. Before Alice could probe further, they heard boots on the porch. Walter entered, carrying a smart riding habit in dark blue wool. I had this delivered from town, he said, laying it across the table. More suitable than what you've been wearing. Be ready in an hour. The habit was beautiful, clearly expensive, but Alice's skin crawled at the thought of wearing it. Still, she nodded obediently and carried it to her room to change. The mirror revealed a different woman than the one who'd left Boston just weeks ago. Her face was tanned from garden work, her hands roughened despite her care with them. The riding habit fit perfectly, which for some reason didn't surprise her, but something about her reflection seemed wrong, as if she were watching a stranger dress for a performance. Through her window, she could see the garden where she'd spent her mornings. The weeds were slowly losing ground to her efforts, and the first seedlings were pushing through the soil. Catherine's bluebonnets still bloomed defiantly among the neat rows Alice had carved out. A movement caught her eye, Jacob, riding in from the north pasture. He dismounted stiffly, favoring his right side, and Alice's hands clenched in the fine wool of her new habit. Even from this distance, she could see the rigid set of his shoulders as Walter approached him. The brothers spoke briefly, Walter gesturing sharply toward the barn while Jacob stood silent. Finally, Jacob led his horse away, his movements carefully controlled. Walter watched him go, then turned toward the house. Alice stepped back from the window quickly, her heart racing. She had to find a way to talk to Jacob alone, to understand what was really happening at Double H Ranch. But first, she had to survive her riding lesson with Walter. She pinned her hair severely under the habit's hat, remembering what Mrs. Sullivan had said about Catherine's lost joy in riding. As she descended the stairs to meet Walter, she squared her shoulders and lifted her chin. She might have to play the role of biddable bride-to-be, but she wouldn't let him break her spirit as he apparently had Catherine's. Walter was waiting in the barn, holding the reins of a docile-looking mare. Not the spirited horse Alice had been learning on with Jacob, but an older animal with a placid disposition. "This is Daisy," Walter said, watching as Alice approached. "More suitable for a lady than that half-wild stallion my brother had you riding." He adjusted the stirrup length, his movements precise and methodical. "We'll start with proper mounting technique. A lady should always mount from a block." Alice gritted her teeth as he led her through basic steps she'd already mastered with Jacob. "Sit straight, heels down, hands just so." Each time she demonstrated competence, Walter found some small flaw to correct. "You're gripping too tightly with your knees," he said, his hands settling on her leg to adjust her position. "A lady should appear to float in the saddle, not cling to it like a ranch hand." Through the barn door, Alice caught glimpses of the ranch hands going about their duties. Once, she saw Jacob cross the yard, his face darkening when he noticed the riding lesson in progress. He changed direction abruptly, disappearing behind the bunkhouse. "Pay attention," Walter snapped, noticing her distraction. "A moment's inattention can lead to accidents." "That's how Catherine," he stopped himself, jaw tightening. "How did Catherine's accident happen?" Alice asked quietly. "It wasn't an accident." The words seemed to surprise Walter himself. He turned away, busying himself with Daisy's tack. "She was willful near the end. Rode out alone, despite my instructions. Caught the fever from being out in the rain." But something in his voice made Alice doubt the story. She remembered Jacob's words in the lined shack about Catherine stopping her riding long before the end. "Walk on," Walter commanded, and Alice obediently guided Daisy forward. They made a slow circuit of the fence training area, Walter calling out corrections to her form. As they passed the garden, Alice noticed fresh boot prints in the mud near Catherine's grave. Someone had been standing there, recently enough that the morning sun hadn't dried the marks. The prints were too large to be from her own garden work, and they led toward the bunkhouse, not the main house. "Eyes forward," Walter said sharply. "A proper lady doesn't let her attention wander." They continued the lesson for another hour, until Alice's muscles ached from maintaining the rigid posture Walter demanded. As he helped her dismount, his hands lingered at her waist longer than necessary. "You'll need daily lessons to be ready for social calls," he said. "Can't have the neighbors thinking I've chosen a bride who can't ride properly." "Social calls?" Alice worked to keep her voice neutral as she removed her gloves. "The Hendersons are hosting a dinner next week. Time to introduce you to proper society." His emphasis on proper made her skin crawl. Mrs. Henderson was quite close to Catherine. "I'm sure she'll have plenty of advice about being a suitable ranch wife." As if summoned by the conversation, Jacob appeared in the barn doorway. "Pete needs you at the north fence, Walter. Says it's urgent." Walter's face hardened at the interruption, but ranch business took precedence. He strode out, leaving Alice and Jacob in an awkward silence. "Are you all right?" they both asked simultaneously, then shared a brief, tense smile. "I've had worse lessons," Alice said, though her hands shook slightly as she unbuckled Daisy's girth. "That's what I'm afraid of." Jacob moved to help her with the saddle, his movements efficient but careful, favoring his right side. "Alice, about yesterday." "You were at her grave this morning," she interrupted. The boot prints had been his, she was certain now. Jacob froze, then slowly set the saddle on its rack. "I make promises I mean to keep," he said finally. "Even to the dead." "What promise?" "To tell the truth, when the time is right." He turned to face her, his expression grave. "Catherine didn't die of fever, Alice. She..." "Jacob!" Walter's voice cracked across the yard like a whip. "I thought I told you to help Pete with that fence." "Pete's managing fine," Jacob replied, not breaking eye contact with Alice. "Just needed an extra set of hands, which he found." Walter appeared in the doorway, his face thunderous. "Then you can help Miller move those cattle to the south pasture. Now." The brothers stared at each other for a long moment, years of unspoken conflicts hanging in the air between them. Finally, Jacob touched the brim of his hat to Alice and walked out, his boots leaving clear prints in the barn dust. As I said, you'll take your lessons from me from now on, Walter said, watching his brother go. And Alice? I expect you to spend less time with the ranch hands. A lady in your position should maintain certain standards. Of course, Alice murmured, though her mind was racing. What had Jacob been about to tell her about Catherine's death? And why did Walter seem so desperate to keep them apart? As she walked back to the house, she noticed Mrs. Sullivan watching from the kitchen window, her face drawn with worry. The housekeeper quickly disappeared from view, but not before Alice saw her making the sign of the cross. Chapter 7: The Wedding Day. Dawn broke over Double H Ranch with an unseasonable chill. Alice stood at her window, watching as pale light crept across Catherine's grave and into the garden where the first tomato plants were starting to climb their stakes. 2 weeks had passed since the riding lesson, 2 weeks of careful conversations and measured steps, 2 weeks of watching Jacob from a distance and feeling Walter's eyes constantly upon her. Today she would become Mrs. Walter Holmes. Miss Foster? Mrs. Sullivan's soft knock preceded her entrance. I've brought your breakfast, though I expect you won't have much appetite. Alice turned from the window to find the housekeeper carrying a tray laden with tea and toast. Behind her came Billy's sister Mary, recently hired as a maid, her arms full of white fabric. Your wedding dress arrived from Dallas last night, Mary said, carefully laying out the gown. Mr. Walter had it specially made. Of course he had. Alice hadn't even been allowed to choose her own wedding dress. The garment was beautiful, she had to admit, ivory silk with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs, perfectly suited for a wealthy ranch wife. It looked nothing like the simpler gown she'd imagined when planning her wedding back in Boston. Preacher Matthews is here early, Mrs. Sullivan said, arranging the breakfast tray. He's asking to speak with you before the ceremony. Alice's hands stilled on the dress. Did he say why? No, but... Mrs. Sullivan glanced at Mary, who took the hint and quietly left the room. He was Catherine's minister, too. Came out special for her funeral, even though Mr. Walter had already arranged for another preacher. Another piece to the puzzle that was Catherine's death. Alice sat at her small vanity, trying to still her trembling hands. Please tell Preacher Matthews I'll meet him in the parlor. She dressed quickly in her morning clothes, postponing the wedding dress for later. The halls were already bustling with activity as ranch hands helped set up for the small reception Walter had planned. Pete was directing the placement of borrowed tables, his face unusually serious. The parlor was cool and quiet, morning light filtering through fresh-washed curtains. Preacher Matthews stood by the window, his back to the door. He was younger than Alice had expected, perhaps in his mid-30s, with kind eyes and a troubled expression. Miss Foster, he said, turning as she entered. Thank you for seeing me. I felt compelled to speak with you before the ceremony. Is something wrong? Alice asked, though she already knew the answer. The minister ran a hand through his graying hair. I've been praying about this, seeking guidance. As a man of God, I have certain obligations to my conscience. He paused, choosing his words carefully. I was there, you see, through all of it. Catherine's marriage, her decline, her final days. Alice's heart began to race. What are you trying to tell me, preacher? Catherine came to me for counsel, near the end. She was afraid. Not of death, but of... He broke off as boots sounded in the hallway. Walter appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of polite inquiry. Preacher Matthews. I wasn't expecting you until noon. Mr. Holmes. The minister's spine straightened. I was just offering Miss Foster some pre-wedding guidance. How thoughtful. Walter's voice was pleasant, but his eyes were hard. Though perhaps such matters could wait until another time? Alice needs to dress for the ceremony. Of course. Preacher Matthews turned back to Alice, something like desperation in his expression. But Miss Foster, if you ever need to talk, my door is always open. About anything. Alice nodded, watching helplessly as Walter ushered the minister out. She could hear their voices in the hall, Walter's smooth assurances about wedding preparations mixing with the minister's more hesitant tones. "Everything all right?" She spun to find Jacob standing in the parlor's side door, his expression guarded. He was already dressed for the wedding in his best clothes, though his collar looked uncomfortably tight. "The minister," Alice said softly, "he was trying to tell me something about Catherine. Preacher Matthews is an honorable man." Jacob stepped closer, lowering his voice. "He was the one who found her, you know. The morning she—" "There you are." Walter reappeared, his face darkening at the sight of his brother. "Shouldn't you be helping with the preparations?" "Just making sure everything's ready in here," Jacob replied evenly. "Wouldn't want anything to mar your perfect day." The brothers stared at each other, the air thick with unspoken words. Finally, Jacob turned to go, but not before Alice caught his whispered warning, "It's not too late." She stood frozen as his footsteps faded, aware of Walter watching her with that measuring gaze she'd come to know so well. The garden was visible through the parlor window, the morning sun now fully illuminating Catherine's grave marker. "You should start dressing," Walter said finally. "We wouldn't want to keep the guests waiting." He paused at the door. "And Alice?" "I've arranged for Jacob to be away on ranch business for the next few weeks. A wedding gift, you might say. Time for us to begin our life together without complications." Alice felt the walls of the parlor closing in around her as she climbed the stairs to her room. The wedding dress waited on its hanger, white and pristine and suffocating. Outside, she could hear more wagons arriving, bringing guests to witness her transformation into Mrs. Walter Holmes. The wedding dress felt like armor as Mrs. Sullivan and Mary helped Alice into it. The silk rustled with every movement, the tight bodice restricting her breathing. In the mirror, she barely recognized herself. Her dark hair had been arranged in an elaborate style that Mary had learned during her time working in a Dallas hotel, and Walter had sent over a pearl necklace that felt like a collar around her throat. "Something's missing," Mrs. Sullivan muttered, then disappeared briefly. She returned with a small sprig of bluebonnets. "From Catherine's garden, your garden now. Every bride needs something blue." Alice's eyes met the housekeeper's in the mirror as she pinned the flowers to the dress. There was a warning there, or perhaps a plea. The ceremony was to take place in the ranch's main room, cleared of its usual furniture to accommodate the 30-odd guests. Through her window, Alice could see more wagons arriving, neighboring ranchers and their wives, the bank president from town, various business associates of Walter's. A soft knock at the door made them all jump. "Alice?" Jacob's voice was barely audible. "Could I need to speak with you." Mrs. Sullivan shooed Mary from the room and followed, closing the door behind them. Alice stood frozen as Jacob entered, his face going still when he saw her in the wedding dress. "You look—" He cleared his throat. "I have something for you." It was our mother's. He held out a small package wrapped in tissue paper. Alice unwrapped it carefully to reveal a delicate silver thimble, worn smooth with use. "Jacob, I can't. Please." His voice was rough. She would have wanted, she always said it should go to someone who would use it with love, not duty. He stepped closer, close enough that she could smell the soap he'd used and something underneath that was purely Jacob. "There's still time. We could." The door opened abruptly, revealing Walter. His face showed no surprise at finding his brother there, only a cold anger that made Alice shiver despite the warm day. "The guests are waiting," he said. "Jacob, you should take your place as best man." The words were precise, pointed. Jacob's hands clenched at his sides, but he nodded stiffly and left. Alice quickly hid the thimble in her dress pocket, feeling its weight like a secret against her hip. The ceremony passed in a blur. Alice found herself standing before Preacher Matthews, aware of Jacob's rigid posture beside his brother, of Mrs. Sullivan's worried face in the crowd, of the weight of eyes upon her. The minister's voice shook slightly as he read the marriage rites. "If anyone knows just 'cause why these two should not be joined." The pause was a fraction too long. Alice felt rather than saw Jacob's slight movement beside them, the intake of breath that might have become words. Then Walter's hand tightened on hers, and the moment passed. "I now pronounce you man and wife." The kiss Walter gave her was brief, proper, possessive. The guests applauded politely, and Alice found herself swept into a reception that seemed to last hours. She accepted congratulations mechanically, ate the store-bought cake that Walter had ordered from Dallas, despite her offer to bake something herself. "Lovely ceremony," the bank president's wife said, fingering her own pearl necklace. "Though not quite as elaborate as dear Catherine's wedding. Do you know, she had roses brought in from Fort Worth? In December, imagine." How nice, Alice managed, but the woman wasn't finished. Of course, that was before the troubles with the first ranch. Such a shame about the fire. But Walter rebuilt beautifully, didn't he? This house is much grander than the old one. Alice's hand froze around her punch glass. Fire? But the woman had already moved on, drawn away by another guest. Alice stood alone for a moment, processing this new information. The first ranch? A fire? She scanned the room for Jacob, needing answers, but he was nowhere to be seen. Through the window, she caught a glimpse of him by the stables, speaking intently with Preacher Matthews. Both men looked grim. Making friends? Walter appeared at her elbow, his hand settling at the small of her back. "Mrs. Henderson was just telling me how impressed she is with your poise. Much more refined than they expected from a Boston seamstress." The words were honey-coated barbs, reminding her of her place. Alice forced a smile, but her mind was racing. What had happened to the first ranch? Why had no one mentioned it before? "The cake is quite good," she said, playing her part. "Though store-bought is never quite the same as homemade." Walter's fingers pressed into her back, a warning. A proper hostess knows when to defer to quality over sentiment. Catherine learned that, eventually. As if summoned by her name, a cloud passed over the sun, throwing Catherine's grave marker into sharp shadow. Alice shivered, despite the warm day. The reception wound down as the sun began to set. Guests departed in their wagons, leaving behind empty punch glasses and crumbs of store-bought cake. Alice stood on the porch, accepting final congratulations, very aware of Walter's presence behind her. Jacob had reappeared for the last of the festivities, his face carefully blank as he bid goodbye to the guests. But as he turned to enter the bunkhouse, his eyes met Alice's. In them she read everything he hadn't said, everything he couldn't say. She was Mrs. Walter Holmes now. And somehow, she knew that made her more prisoner than wife. Chapter 8, Breaking Point. The morning after the wedding, Alice woke in her same narrow bed in the unfinished addition. Walter had declared the master bedroom not yet suitable for a lady's comfort, another promise of future improvements that rang hollow in her ears. Through the gaps in the walls, she could hear him giving instructions to the ranch hands, his voice carrying the same authoritative tone he'd used with her last night when explaining her new duties as his wife. She dressed quickly in her work clothes, ignoring the new dresses Walter had ordered from Dallas. The breakfast routine waited for no one, not even a bride, and she had 8 hungry men to feed. 9, normally, but Jacob had indeed left at dawn for the business trip Walter had arranged. The kitchen seemed emptier without him, though he'd rarely spoken during meals these past weeks. It was the absence of his quiet presence that Alice felt, the loss of those brief glances that had kept her anchored when Walter's controlling nature threatened to overwhelm her. "Heard them arguing something fierce last night," Pete said quietly as she served him breakfast. "The brothers, I mean." After everyone had gone to bed. Alice's hand trembled slightly as she poured his coffee. "About the ranch?" "About a lot of things, I reckon." Pete glanced around to make sure Walter hadn't entered yet. Mr. Jacob was saying something about papers, about telling the truth. Then it got quiet, real sudden-like. The coffee pot nearly slipped from Alice's grasp as she remembered Jacob's whispered warning at the wedding. She'd seen him later, loading his saddlebags by lamplight, his movements stiff as if. "Alice." Walter's voice cut through her thoughts. "You're spilling coffee." She quickly righted the pot, wiping up the small spill with trembling hands. Walter watched her with that measuring gaze she'd come to dread, then turned to Pete. "Davidson, you'll oversee the south pasture while my brother's away. Try not to lose any more cattle to your carelessness." Pete's face reddened, but he nodded and hurried out. The other hands followed quickly, leaving Alice alone with her new husband. "The garden needs weeding," Walter said, buttering his biscuit with precise movements. "And I'll expect you to go through Catherine's old account books today. Time you learned how a proper ranch wife manages the household expenses." Alice gathered her courage. "I thought perhaps I might ride into town, order some supplies." "That won't be necessary." Walter's voice was pleasant but firm. "I've already arranged for all household deliveries. A lady shouldn't trouble herself with such errands." Just like Catherine, Alice thought. Slowly stripped of independence, of simple freedoms, until she was nothing but a well-dressed servant in Walter's carefully ordered world. She waited until he left for the north pasture before slipping into his study. The account books he'd mentioned were stacked neatly on the desk, but it was the locked drawer below them that drew her attention. She'd seen Jacob staring at it before, seen Walter checking its lock each evening. The key proved unnecessary. The lock was expensive but poorly installed, something Jacob had mentioned once while making repairs to the house. Alice's hairpin slid into the mechanism easily and with a bit of manipulation. The drawer opened with a soft click. Inside, she found what looked like years of banking records, letters, and legal documents. On top lay a stack of correspondence in familiar handwriting, her own letters to Walter, arranged by date. But underneath them, he kept them all. Alice startled at Mrs. Sullivan's voice. The housekeeper stood in the doorway, her face drawn with worry. Every letter, from every woman he wrote to after Catherine. Mrs. Sullivan moved closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. 5 of them, before you. All carefully chosen, all proper Boston ladies looking for a new life out west. None of them ever arrived. Alice's hands shook as she lifted another stack of letters. These were replies from various women, each responding to Walter's carefully crafted advertisements. Just like the ones she had answered. What happened to them? They changed their minds, according to Mr. Walter. But Mr. Jacob? Mrs. Sullivan glanced nervously at the door. He tried to warn the last one. Wrote to her himself, telling her about Catherine, about the fire at the old ranch. That's when Mr. Walter sent him to the Colorado properties for 3 months. The thimble in Alice's pocket suddenly felt heavier. A gift from Jacob, but perhaps also a message, a reminder that some things were worth more than duty and propriety. Deeper in the drawer, she found something else, a letter in Catherine's handwriting, dated just days before her death. It was addressed to her family in Tennessee, but had never been sent. Alice began to read, her heart pounding. Dearest Mother, I fear this may be my last letter. Walter has discovered my plans to leave, though I tried to be careful. The money I saved, the arrangements Jacob helped me make, all for nothing. I know now that the fever that took Sarah wasn't natural, that the fire that killed Jonathan wasn't an accident. If anything happens to me... Alice's hands trembled so badly she nearly dropped Catherine's letter when she heard boots on the porch. Mrs. Sullivan quickly helped her return everything to the drawer, closing it just as Walter entered the house. The account books require attention, his voice carried from the hallway. I trust you're making progress? Yes, Alice called back, trying to steady her voice as she hastily opened one of the ledgers. Though some entries are unclear. Walter appeared in the doorway, and for a heart-stopping moment, Alice feared he would notice the slightly misaligned drawer. But his attention was focused on her face, studying her expression with that familiar measuring gaze. Catherine found them confusing as well, he said smoothly. But you're cleverer than she was, aren't you? All that experience with business correspondence in Boston. The words were praise, but they felt like a trap. Alice forced herself to look down at the ledger, pretending to study columns of numbers while her mind raced with the implications of Catherine's letter. Sarah. Jonathan. How many others had there been? A telegram arrived for you, Walter continued, placing an envelope on the desk. From your friend on the train. Miss Jenkins, was it? Alice's heart nearly stopped. Sarah Jenkins, the other mail-order bride, heading to Arizona Territory. With trembling fingers, she opened the telegram. Regret to inform stop Sarah Jenkins found deceased stop circumstances suspicious stop local authorities investigating stop. Alice froze. Why in the world were the authorities notifying her? And then she remembered that she'd given the girl her name and new address in case she ever needed anything. The authorities must have found it and assumed she was kin. How unfortunate, Walter said, watching her reaction. So many dangers out west for unprepared women. Fever, accidents, suspicious characters. He paused meaningfully. Best to stay close to home, wouldn't you agree? Alice managed to nod, though bile rose in her throat. She remembered Sarah's laugh on the train, her dreams of a new life, her brushing off Alice's concerns about her intended's vague letters. I should check on dinner preparations, she said, rising on unsteady legs. Of course. Walter stepped aside to let her pass, then added, Oh, and Alice? I'll need to review any correspondence you send out. For your protection, naturally. These are dangerous times. In the kitchen, she found Mrs. Sullivan waiting with a cup of tea that smelled suspiciously of brandy. Drink it, the housekeeper whispered. You're white as a sheet. Alice sank into a chair, the telegram crumpled in her fist. Sarah Jenkins is dead. The lady from the train? The one you told me about after you arrived? Mrs. Sullivan crossed herself. Lord have mercy. Was it? Suspicious circumstances, Alice quoted bitterly. Just like the fever that wasn't natural, and the fire that wasn't an accident. The housekeeper glanced nervously at the door. Mr. Jacob tried to warn you. He's been trying to gather proof, but Mr. Walter is careful. So very careful. The papers in the drawer, Alice said suddenly. They're proof of something, aren't they? That's what their argument was about last night. Mrs. Sullivan nodded slowly. Mr. Jacob found something in town. Bank records, I think, about insurance payments after the fire. But Mr. Walter caught him trying to show them to the preacher. That explained Jacob's stiff movements as he'd loaded his saddlebags. Not a business trip at all, but an enforced absence, or worse. The rest of the day passed in a fog of terror and calculation. Alice went through the motions of her duties, hyper-aware of Walter's presence whenever he was near. She caught Pete watching her with concern as she served dinner, saw the way he noted her trembling hands and too pale face. That night, after Walter had retired to his study with his usual glass of whiskey, Alice slipped out to the garden. Catherine's grave seemed to glow in the moonlight, the marker casting long shadows across the flourishing vegetable beds. I understand now, she whispered to the stone. Why you planned to run, why you trusted Jacob to help you. A sound behind her made her spin around, heart racing, but it was only Pete, moving carefully in the darkness. Got word from Mr. Jacob, he said quietly, pressing a folded note into her hand. He managed to send it with a cattle buyer heading this way. Says for you to be ready. Help is coming, but you need to hold on just a little longer. Alice clutched the note, not daring to read it in the moonlight where Walter might see from his study window. Is he all right? Bruised up some, but alive. He's in Austin, talking to people who might be able to help. People who investigated the fire at the old ranch and some other suspicious deaths in the territory. From the house came the sound of Walter's study door opening. Pete melted away into the darkness as Alice quickly tucked the note into her pocket alongside Jacob's mother's thimble. Admiring the garden by moonlight? Walter's voice carried across the yard. How poetic. Though you should be careful, the night air can be dangerous. Catherine learned that, eventually. Alice turned to face him, forcing herself to remain calm. I was just checking on the tomato plants. The frost might damage them. Always so practical, Walter said approvingly. Come inside now. A wife's place is with her husband, not wandering the grounds at night. As she followed him into the house, Alice felt the weight of Jacob's note like a burning coal in her pocket. Help was coming. She just had to survive until then. But as she caught Walter watching her with those calculating eyes, she wondered if she would live long enough to see it arrive. Chapter 9: The Truth Revealed. Alice waited 3 days before daring to read Jacob's note. In truth, she was terrified of what it might say. 3 days she played the dutiful wife, feeling Walter's eyes following her every move and watching the road for any sign of help. She finally found her chance when Walter rode out to check the northern pasture fences, leaving her alone with the breakfast dishes. The paper was creased and dirty, as if it had passed through many hands before reaching her. Jacob's usually neat handwriting was hurried, almost frantic. Alice, Catherine, is alive. Living with her family in Tennessee. Walter's first wife didn't die in the fire either, she escaped. I've found her. Everything was a lie. The papers in his study prove it. Look in the false bottom of the drawer. Be careful. I'm coming. J. The coffee cup she had been washing slipped from the edge of the counter, shattering on the floor. Mrs. Sullivan rushed in at the sound. Child, what's wrong? You're white as a ghost. Alice wordlessly handed her the note. The housekeeper's face went slack with shock as she read it. Sweet Jesus, she whispered, crossing herself. I knew something wasn't right about that funeral. Closed casket, no body viewing, and Mr. Walter insisting on burying her here instead of the churchyard. Help me search his study, Alice said, already moving. Before he returns. The false bottom of the drawer yielded easily to careful pressure. Inside, they found a stack of documents that made Alice's blood run cold. Insurance claims for 2 separate ranch fires. Death certificates with different names but suspiciously similar circumstances. Letters from Catherine to her family in Tennessee, never sent, describing her growing fear of her husband's controlling nature. And most damning of all, divorce papers. Not from Catherine, but from Walter's first wife, Rebecca. Papers that proved she had left him years before the fire that supposedly killed her, taking their infant son with her. He lied about everything, Alice breathed, spreading the papers across the desk. The tragic widower, the fever that killed Catherine, the fire that took his first wife and child, all of it carefully crafted to make him appear the victim. The other women, Mrs. Sullivan said suddenly. The ones who answered his adverts but never arrived. We have to find out what happened to them. Alice was already scanning the documents, her hands shaking. There's a pattern. He finds women with no close family, women looking to escape difficult circumstances. Convinces them to travel west with promises of security and refinement. Then when they discover the truth about him. She broke off as hoofbeats sounded in the yard. But instead of Walter's measured pace, these were fast, urgent. Alice rushed to the window to see Pete dismounting in a cloud of dust. He's coming back early, Pete called up to the house. Rode past Miller on the north road. Said something about a cattle buyer. Alice's heart nearly stopped. The cattle buyer who had carried Jacob's note must have been found out. Walter knew. Get those documents back in the drawer, Mrs. Sullivan ordered, her usually gentle voice sharp with fear. Pete, stall him if you can. But as Alice gathered the papers with trembling hands, another document caught her eye. A telegraph from Walter to someone in Tennessee, dated just days after her arrival. Found her stop living with family, stop handle its stop payment as arranged stop. He's having Catherine followed, Alice realized. He knows where she is, knows she's alive. And now he knows that you know, Mrs. Sullivan finished grimly. Child, you have to run. Today. Pete can saddle a horse, get you supplies. No. Alice stood straighter, her mother's words about strength echoing in her mind. Running is what he expects. It's what Catherine did, what his first wife did. He's built his whole story around being the abandoned husband. She gestured to the documents scattered across the desk. This is proof of what he really is. Of what he's done. Mrs. Sullivan's eyes widened. Alice, no. It's too dangerous. If he finds you with these papers, then at least the truth will be known. Alice quickly sorted the documents into order, her seamstress's hand steady despite her fear. Catherine is alive, which means this marriage isn't even legal. His first wife is alive too, with proof of divorce papers he never signed. The insurance investigations, the suspicious deaths. She broke off as more hoofbeats approached, slower this time. Measured. Deliberate. Walter. Get these to Preacher Matthews, she whispered, pressing the most damning documents into Mrs. Sullivan's hands. No matter what happens here today, make sure he sees them. The housekeeper clutched the papers to her chest, tears streaming down her lined face. What are you gonna do? Alice touched the thimble in her pocket, thinking of Jacob's mother who had died too young, of Catherine hiding her fear behind a smile, of Rebecca fleeing with her baby into the night. Even of Sarah Jenkins, who would never see her dreams of a new life realized. I'm going to end this, she said, just as Walter's boots sounded on the porch steps. One way or another. Mrs. Sullivan barely had time to slip out the back door with the documents before Walter entered. Alice stood calmly behind his desk, the remaining papers arranged neatly before her. She had chosen her battlefield. You're in my study, Walter said, his voice dangerously quiet. Going through my private papers. Your forgeries, you mean? Alice met his gaze steadily. Your carefully constructed lies about dead wives who aren't dead at all. Something shifted in Walter's face, a subtle change that transformed his handsome features into something hard, cold. I see Jacob has been sharing his wild theories. My brother always did have an overactive imagination. Catherine is alive. Alice watched his reaction carefully. In Tennessee, with her family. Just like Rebecca escaped with her son before the first fire. Walter closed the study door with deliberate care. You've been busy this morning, haven't you? Though not with the duties of a proper wife. A proper wife? Alice's laugh held no humor. Like Sarah Jenkins was meant to be a proper wife? Before she met with her suspicious circumstances? Tragic, what happened to that Miss Jenkins? Walter moved closer, his boots silent on the carpet. So many dangers for women traveling alone in the territories. One has to be careful. Alice stood her ground, though every instinct screamed at her to run. Is that what you told the other women who answered your advertisements? The ones who never arrived? Did you warn them to be careful too? You're becoming hysterical, Walter said smoothly. Perhaps you should lie down. The Texas heat can affect delicate constitutions. That's what you told Catherine, isn't it? When she started asking questions about Rebecca? About the fire? Alice's hand curled around Jacob's mother's thimble in her pocket. Did you keep her isolated, controlled, until she had no choice but to run? Walter's facade cracked slightly. Catherine was unstable. Confused. She imagined threats where none existed. She was right about you. Alice gestured to the papers on the desk. The insurance investigations prove it. 2 ranch fires, 2 convenient deaths that weren't deaths at all. How many others have there been? You disappoint me, Alice. Walter's voice hardened. I thought you were different. Practical. Understanding of a man's need to maintain order in his household. Order? Alice's voice rose. Is that what you call it? Terrorizing women into submission or flight, then using their disappearances to paint yourself as the tragic victim? A floorboard creaked behind her, and Alice realized too late that Walter had been slowly maneuvering her away from the door. She was trapped between him and the window, Catherine's grave marker visible in the morning light. You're my wife now, Walter said softly. Everything I've done has been to build something lasting. Something proper. The other women, they couldn't understand that. But you, with your business sense, your appreciation for order. I understand perfectly. Alice's fingers closed around the thimble. I understand that you're a monster who preys on women's dreams of a better life and then breaks them when they discover the truth. Walter moved with surprising speed. His hand closed around her throat, not squeezing but holding her in place. Such dramatic accusations. But who would believe them? The bitter imaginings of another unstable wife? Like poor Catherine, driven mad by the sun and isolation? People already believe them. Alice forced herself to smile, though terror coursed through her. Jacob has proof. He's found Rebecca, found Catherine. The authorities are involved now. Jacob won't be a problem much longer. Walter's grip tightened slightly. Accidents happen, especially on dangerous ranch business. Like Sarah's accident? Like the fire that was supposed to kill Rebecca? Alice kept her voice steady, praying her gamble would work. The papers are already with Preacher Matthews. Everything, Walter. The insurance claims, the letters, the proof that Catherine is alive. Your careful order is falling apart. Walter's other hand shot out, catching her wrist as she tried to step away. You've ruined everything, he snarled, his controlled facade finally cracking completely. I gave you a chance at a proper life, at being a proper wife, and this is how you repay me? Walter. Pete's voice carried from outside. Riders coming. Looks like the marshal's office. Alice saw the moment Walter's control snapped entirely. His face contorted with rage as he shoved her hard against the window frame. Pain exploded in her shoulder, but she kept her eyes locked on his. It's over, she gasped. Catherine escaped you. Rebecca escaped you. And now everyone will know the truth. No, Walter said, reaching for something in his desk drawer. They'll know another tragic story about a young wife's mental deterioration. About her unfortunate accident while her loving husband was trying to help her. The last thing Alice saw before consciousness faded was Catherine's grave marker through the window, the morning sun making the white stone glow like a beacon of truth finally revealed. Chapter 10, Spring Renewal. The world swam back into focus slowly, punctuated by shouts from outside and the cold press of metal against Alice's temple. She was on her knees now, Walter behind her, using her body as a shield as he faced the study door. Back away, he shouted. Or this ends badly for everyone. Alice's vision cleared enough to see Pete and Mrs. Sullivan in the doorway, both frozen in horror. Behind them, she could hear horses and men's voices in the yard. Mr. Holmes. A commanding voice carried from outside. This is Marshal Clayton. We have the house surrounded. Come out peacefully. Walter's laugh held no trace of his usual controlled demeanor. Peacefully? Like Catherine left peacefully? Like Rebecca? The gun pressed harder against Alice's head. Tell them what happens to wives who don't understand their proper place. Walter, Pete said carefully, raising his empty hands. Think about what you're doing. The marshal has witnesses. Catherine is going to give testimony in Austin. Alice felt Walter's grip tighten at the mention of Catherine. She was mine, he snarled. They were all mine. I gave them everything, position, security, a proper life. And they betrayed me. Just like Alice here, going through my private papers, conspiring with my brother. Your brother is alive, Mrs. Sullivan interjected quickly. He's with the marshal's party. Let Alice go, Anne. Jacob? Walter's voice rose. That traitor dares to come back here? Alice felt him shift, turning slightly toward the window. In that moment of distraction, she drove her elbow backward with all her strength. At the same time, she grabbed the hand holding the gun, forcing it upward as Walter stumbled. The gun went off with a deafening crack. Plaster dust rained down as the bullet hit the ceiling. Alice twisted away, but Walter recovered quickly, lunging for her with a roar of rage. "Alice!" Jacob's voice came from the window, followed by the sound of breaking glass. Everything happened at once. Walter grabbed Alice's hair, yanking her back as Jacob vaulted through the shattered window. Pete rushed forward from the doorway. The gun went off again, and Alice heard Mrs. Sullivan scream. She fought with desperate strength, remembering Catherine's unsent letters, Sarah Jenkins's tragic telegram, the other women who had faced Walter's rage. The thimble was still in her pocket, pressing against her hip as she struggled. Jacob's mother had survived a hard man, had found moments of joy despite him. Alice would not let Walter claim another victim. "You're nothing," Walter shouted, trying to aim the gun at Jacob while keeping hold of Alice. "Nothing but a disappointment, always undermining my work, my proper." Alice slammed her head backward, catching Walter's chin. His grip loosened just enough for her to drop and roll aside as Jacob tackled his brother. The gun skittered across the floor, stopping at Pete's feet. "It's over, Walter," Jacob said, pinning his brother down. Blood ran down his face from a cut on his forehead. Catherine testified about everything, the threats, the control, how you tried to control her letters to her family. Rebecca's come forward too. Walter bucked and thrashed, his face purple with rage. "They were mine. The ranch was mine. Father gave it to me, not some weak younger son who doesn't understand about proper order." "Our father was a monster too," Jacob ground out, struggling to hold him. But at least he didn't hide it behind fancy words and proper manners. The marshal and his deputies burst into the study, quickly taking control of Walter. As they hauled him to his feet, he fixed Alice with a look of pure hatred. "You'll never prove anything," he spat. "My word against a bunch of hysterical women and a jealous brother. No jury will." "We have the insurance investigators' reports," Marshal Clayton cut in. "And witnesses from the bank about certain irregular transactions. Catherine provided quite a detailed account of your methods, Mr. Holmes. As did Miss Rebecca Thompson, or should I say, the first Mrs. Holmes." Walter's face went slack with shock. For the first time, Alice saw real fear in his eyes. "Take him out," the marshal ordered. "Carefully. There's quite a list of charges to answer to." As they led Walter away, Alice sagged against Jacob's supporting arm. Through the broken window, she could see the garden where she'd worked so hard these past weeks. Catherine's bluebonnets still bloomed defiantly among the neat rows of vegetables. "I thought." Her voice shook. "When you didn't come back after the wedding. Walter had some of his men waylay me," Jacob explained, his arm tightening around her. "But they weren't expecting Pete to be following them. He got me to Austin, to the marshal's office, where Catherine had already started talking to the authorities." Outside, they could hear Walter's continued raving as the deputies loaded him into a secure wagon. Mrs. Sullivan appeared with bandages for Jacob's head wound, her hands shaking but efficient. "Catherine wants to meet you," Jacob said softly as the housekeeper worked. "She'll stay in Austin until the trial. Says she needs to thank the woman who finally ended it." Alice touched the thimble in her pocket. "What happens to the ranch now?" "That's complicated," Marshal Clayton said. He had returned, holding a stack of papers. "The property's tied up in legal questions. The first Mrs. Holmes, Rebecca, she has some claim through her son. Then there's the matter of the insurance fraud, and your own situation." "My situation?" "The marriage isn't legal," Jacob explained. "Since Rebecca and Catherine are very much alive, Walter was never free to marry again. You're not bound to any of this." The words took a moment to sink in. Alice looked around the study where she'd discovered the truth, through the broken window to Catherine's false grave marker and the garden beyond. "The hands need their jobs," she said finally. "And the cattle need tending. Whatever legal battles are coming, the ranch itself can't just stop." Jacob's face softened with something like pride. "I can handle the immediate operations, if the marshal agrees. At least until everything's sorted out." Actually, the marshal cleared his throat. Given the circumstances, we'd prefer to have someone with a clear head for business helping to untangle Walter's accounts. Someone who can work with the bank to trace all his dealings. He looked meaningfully at Alice. I understand you have experience with bookkeeping. A week ago, such a suggestion would have been scandalous. But now, with Walter's carefully constructed world of proper behavior exposed as a sham, Alice felt the first stirring of real freedom. I'd need to send some letters, she said. To my former clients in Boston, to retrieve references about my business experience. No need, Jacob said quietly. All of us here will vouch for you. Alice stared at him. You were that sure I'd stay? His eyes met hers with the same intensity she remembered from their rides together. I was sure you deserved the choice. A real one, not Walter's manipulations. Mrs. Sullivan made a sound suspiciously like a suppressed chuckle as she finished bandaging Jacob's head. Through the window, Alice could see Pete organizing the other hands, maintaining the ranch's routine despite the morning's chaos. Life went on. The garden's doing well, she said thoughtfully. Those techniques Catherine developed, that Pete remembered, they work. The ranch could expand that side of operations, maybe supply vegetables to the growing towns nearby. Jacob smiled. Catherine would like that. She always said there was more to ranching than just cattle. There's more to everything than what Walter allowed, Alice replied. She turned to the marshal. I'll help with the accounts. And I'd like to write to Rebecca as well. Her son should know his legacy here when he's old enough. As the afternoon wore on, the ranch slowly returned to its normal rhythm. The marshal's men took Walter to the town jail, where he would await trial. Mrs. Sullivan organized a proper meal for everyone, though she insisted on serving it on the porch. Alice found herself sitting on the porch steps as sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and purple. Jacob settled beside her, careful of his bandaged head. Mother's thimble suits you, he said, noticing how she turned it in her fingers. It's seen a lot of changes. Alice looked out over the ranch, her garden, the grazing cattle, the hands going about their evening tasks. Like this place we'll see now. Good changes, Jacob agreed. Though some folks in town might not think it proper, having a woman involved in ranch management. Alice laughed, really laughed, for what felt like the first time in weeks. Proper is an interesting word. Walter used it to cage people. But maybe it's time for a new definition out here. And what would that be? She turned to face him, seeing in his eyes the same mix of hope and caution she felt in her own heart. Proper is what works. What helps people grow instead of controlling them. What lets them choose their own path. Jacob's hand found hers, warm and calloused and nothing like his brother's cold grip. And what path are you choosing, Alice Foster? She looked at their intertwined fingers, then out at the ranch where Catherine's bluebonnets still bloomed in the garden she'd loved. Spring was deepening into summer, bringing new growth, new possibilities. I choose to stay, she said softly. Not as Walter's proper wife, but as myself. To help build something real here, something honest. She squeezed his hand. If you're willing to partner with a Boston seamstress who has some ideas about ranching. Jacob's smile held all the warmth his brothers had lacked. I think we can work something out. Though we might want to wait until after the trial to discuss certain partnerships. Alice nodded, content for now to sit in the fading light, holding the hand of a man who had never tried to cage her. Tomorrow would bring challenges, the trial, the legal battles, the task of reshaping the ranch into something new. But for the first time since arriving in Texas, she felt truly free to face them. Behind them, Catherine's grave marker caught the last rays of sunset, no longer a symbol of Walter's lies, but a reminder of the strength of women who refuse to be broken. Alice touched the thimble in her pocket and smiled. Some things, she had learned, were worth fighting for. Epilogue. Spring, 1876. The wedding took place in the garden, among blooming bluebonnets and rows of thriving vegetables. Alice stood beneath an arch of Texas wildflowers, wearing a dress she'd made herself, simple, elegant, and utterly unlike the elaborate gown Walter had ordered for her first wedding. Jacob waited for her there, his smile as warm as the spring sunshine. Pete stood as his best man, while Catherine, visiting from Tennessee, served as Alice's matron of honor. The ranch hands filled the makeshift pews, alongside townspeople who had gradually come to accept that the Double H Ranch operated differently now. "Never thought I'd see the day," Mrs. Sullivan whispered, dabbing at her eyes as Preacher Matthews performed the ceremony. A ranch run by a husband and wife as true partners. Indeed, the past year had brought changes that would have scandalized Walter's notion of propriety. The vegetable operation, expanded under Alice's management, now supplied 3 growing towns. Her small dressmaking business operated from a converted room in the ranch house, serving clients who appreciated having the latest Boston styles adapted for Texas life. Rebecca's son, now 12, spent his summers at the ranch, learning both cattle operations from Jacob and business sense from Alice. His mother had refused any claim to the property, asking only that her boy have the chance to know his heritage, the good parts of it. Walter's trial had ended in a life sentence. The evidence, once fully revealed, had uncovered more victims than anyone had suspected. But his conviction had brought unexpected healing. Catherine found her voice as an advocate for women's rights in Tennessee. Rebecca remarried and opened a small school. Even Sarah Jenkins's family found some peace in knowing the truth about their daughter's fate. "The garden looks beautiful," Catherine said after the ceremony, walking with Alice among the neat rows. "Different from how I planned it, but better. Stronger." "Like all of us," Alice replied, touching the silver thimble that now hung on a chain around her neck. Later, as the celebration continued under lantern light, Jacob found Alice by Catherine's old grave marker, kept now as a reminder rather than a deception. "Ready to move it?" he asked softly. Alice nodded. They had discussed this, deciding that the marker belonged in the small ranch cemetery where other members of the home's family rested. Not as a false grave, but as a monument to survival. "The bluebonnets will still bloom here," she said, looking at the thriving garden. "But they'll grow other places too. Catherine taught us that beauty can survive anywhere, if you're brave enough to plant it." Jacob's arm slipped around her waist as the spring breeze carried the sound of laughter from their guests. "Speaking of planting," he said with a smile, "we might need to expand the vegetable plots again soon. Make room for smaller hands to learn gardening." Alice smiled at him warmly. "Yes. Hopefully, someday soon. And as long as we teach them the real meaning of proper," she said. "About growing strong instead of being controlled. About blooming wherever they're planted." Above them, the stars emerged in the Texas night sky, witnessing another spring renewal at the Double H Ranch, where proper now meant true, and strong, and free. The end. Thank you for listening to this heartwarming story by Annie Clayton. You can be assured that all her books are clean and wholesome. To find other clean romances, please visit www.tikahousepublishing.com. Remember to hit like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next Annie Clayton Western Romance.